give some announcements. So next Sunday, I will be in Morris. So Brian will have Sunday school next Sunday. And then the Sunday after, so let's see, this is March 30th. So then the Sunday after, we have the Mansells. So the missionaries will be here in the afternoon. So Sunday school will be combined. We'll have the missionaries. Then the Sunday after that, we'll have Sunday school here. And the Sunday after that is Easter. No Sunday school. And then it'll go. So, but the new Sunday school classes are now scheduled to begin the first Sunday in June. So we have about 7 Sundays left to finish our series instead of 2. So we'll be able to take some more time. And I'm planning on probably 3 just on the Day of Atonement. And probably 2 or 3 on the impurities. So we'll see how this goes. But we have a lot more time. I don't have to rush for Sunday school. So next week, be Brian, I'll be gone. And then the week after, we have the Mansells. All right, so today we're starting Leviticus 11 through 15. Why are the sacrificial system in the Old Testament? The question, how can a holy God live with a sinful people? So that's the question we're asking. The book of Leviticus is answering. And we're going to start on uncleanness today. We're going to talk about food laws, which is good timing since we had food out here, some of which wasn't kosher. And we'll talk about a couple of Sundays on uncleanness, and then we'll have a few Sundays on atonement. I'd like to spend one Sunday just talking about the word atonement and what it means, at least one Sunday. All right, so uncleanness. So Leviticus 11, there's a verse in Leviticus 10. Leviticus 10 is in the section about the priests. And it's Moses teaching Aaron and his sons what they're to do as priests. And in verse 10, Leviticus 10, verse 10, Moses says to Aaron, "You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses." And this is Aaron and his sons. So you have Aaron, who's the high priest, the first high priest until he dies. He has 4 sons who are priests under him. But then all of the tribe of Levi serve the people of Israel. Some of them serve as priests. Some of them live out in the communities. And even the ones who live out in the cities are to teach the people these things. They're supposed to teach the people the law and teach the people this. But we have this distinction between the holy and the common and the pure and the impure. And the word unclean is the same as the word impure, and the word clean is the same as the word pure. So pure and clean are the same, and impure and unclean are the same. So what does it mean to be, that something is holy? When something is made holy, it's set apart for a special task, usually to serve God in the Old Testament context. It's something that's set apart. Aaron was considered holy after he was ordained and set apart to serve God as the high priest. What's common then is everything else. It's not necessarily unholy, it's just the common everyday people. So the common everyday people aren't set aside for that. Now we'll see in Leviticus 11, there are even utensils. So like what we cook with, what we serve food with in the kitchen, okay, they had utensils that were set aside that could only be used in the tabernacle. Those were holy because they were set aside for that use. you couldn't take one home and use it at home. Here at the church, people probably take things home all the time. It's not a big deal. But in the Old Testament, once something was set aside, it was made holy. It was no longer common. If something was holy and somebody used it for a common purpose, it would become impure, and the utensil would have to be then cleansed and made holy again in order to be restored. In some cases it could, in some cases it couldn't. And then, so we have holy and common are categories, what we're going to see, and this pure and impure, these are categories that we're going to see. And then I wanted to make a comment about moral versus ritual impurity. So there's two different kinds of impurity in the scriptures. One is moral impurity, one is ritual impurity. We're going to be looking at ritual impurity. Ritual impurity has kind of three characteristics or three things that make it distinct. What causes someone to be ritually impure is genuinely natural. In fact, I'll just point this out here. So, eating certain foods that you're not supposed to, giving birth to a child, having leprosy or skin disease of some kind, uncommon sexual issues, and then death. So when we talk about them as being natural, these are things that come naturally out of the state of being a human being. They're not something that somebody does in order, like commits a sin to become impure. And what's interesting is they are, when we say more or less unavoidable, they actually are unavoidable. You can't live life without being impure in one of those senses. I think Jesus did, but it's not sinful to contract one of these impurities, which I would agree with. And when we get through to the end of all of them, I'll explain that in more detail. And these impurities, some of these impurities can also be shared with other people. So if you're impure and you touch someone else who isn't, that person becomes impure. So they have like a contagion to them. They're kind of contagious. Moral impurity is a result of immoral acts. It's usually a very grave sin, like some of the examples that we have in Scripture are terrible sins that cause impurity or defilement. Sometimes it's translated as. The person who is defiled can't pass that defilement on to anyone else. There's no contagion. The impurity could be permanent. There's no rituals that take away the impurity. And then there's other terms like abomination and pollution. And these are usually reserved for things like idolatry, sexual sins, and murder. So we're talking about, in these next few chapters in Leviticus, we are talking about ritual impurities. And because for these, there's a solution. So, holy and common, and pure and impure, or clean and unclean, and then moral versus ritual. So we're dealing with a ritual sin. So in Leviticus 11, we're dealing with food laws, which we'll talk about today. Childbirth laws, which are actually rather interesting, in Leviticus 12. Leviticus 12 is very short, but the reason it's interesting is it's actually cited in Luke chapter 1 or 1, I think it is, maybe 2. Luke 1 or 2 cites Leviticus 12 in an interesting context. The discussion of leprosy is fascinating for a lot of reasons. And so I'd like to cover leprosy, if I can. And Leviticus 15, we're probably not going to look at in great detail. Leviticus 12 references Leviticus 15. We'll probably touch on some things there in general, but we probably won't spend a lot of time in Leviticus 15. And Numbers 19 deals with death, and we'll probably look a little bit at that when we look at leprosy, even though it's not in our Leviticus passage. So today we want to talk about food. With ritual impurity, I should mention, there's different ways of becoming pure again in the Old Testament. So if a person is pure, that's the default state, then you become impure through some reason. Sometimes you just have to wait and you become pure again. Sometimes you have to wash, take a bath, and wait, and then you become pure again. And sometimes there are offerings that you have to give, and wash, and wait, some combination. So those things make you clean again or make you pure again. All right, so food. The food laws are stated in Deuteronomy 14 also. They're restated there. In Exodus, there's not a lot of food laws. There's a couple that are given, but nothing like this. So the food laws in Leviticus 11, and we'll look at this briefly. I want to make some other points as well. I want to spend more time on a couple other points, but Leviticus 11 starts in verse 1. It says, "The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, These are the living things you may eat among all the animals that are on the earth." Okay, so as you recall, as we talk about a law, this is kind of the title of the law. This is the food you're allowed to eat. And food you're allowed to eat is called clean. Okay, so those are clean animals. Now, what's interesting is Noah had to bring clean animals and unclean animals onto the ark, if you recall. So there's a distinction between clean and unclean that goes back all the way to early chapters of Genesis. But we aren't given any details back then. So the law says, whatever parts the hoof and is cloven-footed and chews the cud, those are the animals that you can eat. So they have to have a divided hoof and they have to chew their cud. If they do one or the other, you can't eat them. They're unclean. If they do neither, they're unclean. They have to have both of these things. So a rabbit, for example, is unclean. Sorry, John. The rabbit chews the cud, but the rabbit does not divide the hoof. So the rabbit is unclean. Of course, the most common example of this, the most well-known, is pork or pigs. Pigs divide the hoof, but they don't chew the cud. So they're unclean. He says, so verse 3, whatever says, but on verse 4, nevertheless, among those that chew the cud or part the hoof, you shall not eat of these. Okay, so here they give us a bunch of examples. Now, the Jewish people, like I mentioned today, and Pastor mentioned this when he talks about setting up fences around the law, but then find loopholes around the law. So that phrase in verse 2, animals that are on the earth. So there are Jews today in Israel who will raise pigs. And you say, well, how can you do that? It's against the law. What they do is they build platforms that are off the ground. So where the pigs live, the pigs aren't touching the ground. The pigs aren't on the earth. That's how they get around these things. Because they know that there's money in bacon. So you know. So anyway, yes, and I've had that substantiated from a couple of different people who have lived over in Israel. All right, so then he gives us some examples of animals who are unclean: the camel, the badger, the hare, which I mentioned, the pig, as I mentioned. And then in verse 8 he says, "You shall not eat any of their flesh, and you shall not touch their carcasses." So this idea of one, eating them, but two, you're not allowed to touch the carcass. We're going to see that when an animal dies, there's laws against touching the carcass of an animal that dies of its own accord. So it's okay to slaughter an animal to eat it, such as a cow or a bull, but if that cow or bull dies of its own accord and you come upon it and it is dead, you cannot eat it. And touching it to dispose of the carcass makes you unclean. In fact, you can't even use sticks to like move it along and say, well, I'm not touching it, because it'll say you're still unclean according to the law. That's why I used the analogy a couple weeks ago. If you run over a dead animal with your car, the animal's already dead and you run over it with your car. Are you unclean? I think my interpretation of the law is that you would be, because the car touched it. But that's for rabbinic discussions. And it doesn't pertain to us today, these laws. I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, verse 9 then, he goes on to say, talks about seafood, verses 9 through 12. Then he talks about different birds, 13 through 19. Then he gets into insects in verses 11, or in 13 through 20 through 23, sorry. All the winged insects that go on all fours are detestable to you. But he says you can if they have certain jointed legs. And so there's this exception of eating the locusts, the crickets, and the grasshoppers. Now, John the Baptist, it said that he was out in the wilderness, and what did he eat? Locusts and wild honey. And some people say, well, certainly he wasn't eating bugs. Well, he could have been. He could have been eating locusts. Those were clean. It would have been allowed. There's no reason to think he couldn't. Now, some people will say, well, it's the same word for a locust tree, and the locust tree bears fruit, which is true, and that's correct. So they think maybe he was eating the fruit of the locust tree, which is like a bean. And that would be okay too, but there's nothing wrong with saying that he was eating locusts. So the New Testament's unclear, but he's not in violation of the law if he were eating locusts. If you want to eat crickets, I hear they're not very tasty, but if you want to eat crickets, you can go ahead. Now you'll notice in verse 24, there's this little, I put it in brackets even, the law restated and cleansing and having a cleansing ritual. He says, and by these you shall become unclean. Whoever touches their carcass shall be unclean until the evening. So if you're out in the woods or something and you stumble across one of these animals that's dead and you want to bury it or take care of the carcass or move it off your property or something, and you do that, you're unclean until the evening. So you have to wait until evening before you would do any exercise at the tabernacle. So this idea of being unclean means that you can't participate in anything at the tabernacle. And because you're contagious, you can't interact in society. So you have to go home, you're in timeout, and you have to wait until dark. So then at dark, you become clean again, and you can eat with your family, you can interact in society, you can go to the tabernacle if you want to. Verse 25, this explains more about the carcass. Whoever carries any part of the carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean. So here you have to wash your clothes and wait till evening to be clean, as part of that ritual. So you don't have to take a bath, you just have to wash your clothes. Verse 26, every animal that parts the hoof but is not cloven-footed or does not chew the cud is unclean to you. Everyone who touches them shall be unclean. So here it says you can't even touch them, evidently, when they're alive. All that walk on their paws, animals that go on all fours are unclean to you. So no eating apes or cats. I don't know who would want to eat a cat. You would do okay?
What's the difference between the parted hoof and the cloven hoof?
The difference between the parted hoof and the cloven hoof, so if I understand it correctly, maybe I should have my wife. The cloven hoof is what we think of like a deer. It's a hard hoof that's cloven. A parted hoof would be like a goat. Do I have that right? No. A goat's like a deer. What am I thinking of?
Maybe like a taper?
Like a taper?
Yeah, in the jungle, they have a parted foot that's not a paw, but it's not a hoof.
So it's not a paw, but it's not a hoof. It's soft,
Yeah.
but it's still hoof-like. Something like that. It doesn't have toes.
Sort of. Alpacas,
Alpacas,
they have toes, but they don't have hooves.
yes. And they, right,
But they should have.
but they chew the cud. So an alpaca would be a good example. Lost my spot here.
So deers are good.
Yeah, deers are good. So we're okay with the venison that we had. I'm assuming that was venison sausage he had up there. And whoever carries the carcass shall wash his clothes and be unclean till evening, and they are unclean to you. So the cleansing process then is simply wash your clothes and wait. Or if you just happen to touch one, you just have to wait. But if you handle it, then you also have to wash your clothes. Now, this idea of being unclean is not hygiene. We have to kind of get that thought out of our mind. To be clean or unclean can be, it's a state. It's not being dirty. One person defined it as being simply out of place. Dirt out of place is what one person called it. Okay, so it's not being dirty. So when a really good example of this came up with the COVID vaccine. And I don't know what your position is on the COVID vaccine, but regardless, what happened was you had those who got the COVID vaccine and those who did not. And those who did not were considered unclean. You weren't supposed to go near those people. They weren't supposed to go out in society. They weren't allowed to travel on airplanes. They weren't allowed to go to work. They weren't allowed to go to the, whatever. They weren't allowed. Some people were saying they shouldn't get medical care. Okay, so this is how we talked about those people that didn't have a COVID vaccine. It wasn't a hygiene thing. At first it might have been a hygiene thing, but it wasn't a hygiene thing. It was, you're in a state of unvaccination. We are casting you out of society. Okay? And it could have been anything. It didn't have to be a vaccine. But that was a case of clean and unclean in our modern day thinking. So here, if you're unclean, you're out of society until dark, and you wash your clothes, then you're unclean. So it's not because you're actually dirty or filthy or you got some kind of disease from touching these animals. That wasn't the case. So in verse 29, go on to the next section here. So then we have some animals and some examples of unclean animals. Then some creepy crawlies. Don't eat creepy crawlies. That's the That's the moral of that. But we have some swarming things on the ground. The rat, the mouse, the lizard, geckos, these kinds of things that they call swarming animals or swarming things. They aren't anything else. It gets into cooking. Let's see. Like in verse 33, and if any of them falls into an earthenware vessel, all that is in it shall be unclean, and you shall break it. Okay, so imagine you've got an earthenware vessel as a pot, a clay pot. Let's say you've got it full of flour, and the lid's off. One of these animals dies, some mouse dies up on a shelf or your roof, and falls into it. Now it's got to be dead first. Okay, so it's died, then it falls into your flour. Well, you got to dump all the flour out. You got to smash the earthen vessel. You'll just lost everything. Moral of the story, keep the lid on your flour, right? Keep the weevils out of the flour, I guess maybe is a good proverb from that. Likewise, when you're making soup, this one I think would be a little bit harder. Verse 33, and if any of them falls into we did that one. Verse 34, any food that is in it that could have been eaten or water is unclean. Everything has to be dumped. Verse 35, everything on which any part of the carcass falls shall be unclean, whether oven or stove, it shall be broken in pieces. Now their ovens and stove were made out of clay, bricks. So these are brick ovens. So they're earthenware. Nevertheless, a spring or a cistern holding water shall be clean, but whoever touches a carcass in them shall be unclean. So if you've got an in-ground cistern well for your water, you don't have to drain that and destroy your cistern. But when you reach in to take that dead mouse out of there, okay, well, you're unclean till the evening. So you still don't get past that. And then on seed grain, etc. Verse 39 says that if any animal which you may eat, so it's a clean animal, you may eat it, if it dies, which means it dies of its own accord, whoever touches it, its carcass shall be unclean till the evening. So if it's a clean animal, a flock of your herd, it's a sheep, but it dies, you go out, you're checking your flock, and you find that you've got a dead sheep out there, you need to dispose of the carcass, you can't eat it. But you have to dispose of the carcass, which means you will be clean until evening. And if you handle the carcass, you have to wash your clothes. And then the swarming things on the ground is detestable. It shall not be eaten. Don't pick up rocks and eat the things underneath them. John, I've seen you try that. Those centipedes. Not that quick. Yeah, don't eat the centipedes. Don't eat the things underneath the rocks. That's the thing. There. Now you'll notice that these food laws also pattern creation, which is an interesting thing. When it's not the same order, but it's close. You have seafood, and you have birds, and you have insects, and then you have animals. The creepy crawlies just kind of come at the end, but it does follow what is going on in creation, which is interesting. Then the law is summarized at the end. He says in verse 44, "For I am the Lord your God, consecrate yourselves therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. And you shall not defile yourself or make yourself impure or unclean with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy as I am holy." And then he gives a summary statement of the law, which is typical in our law section. Now, what I'd like to do in our last last few minutes is talk a little bit about three things, I guess. The purpose of these laws, the cleansing rituals, and then how this kind of, how it doesn't apply to us. So when we think about why did God say you could eat some animals and not others? And like I said, this distinction goes back to Noah, although we're not told the difference back then in Noah's day. We're just told that Noah knew the difference between clean and unclean animals. So God must have revealed it to him what that meant. So you'll hear it said that the reason God gave the people of Israel these food laws was to keep them healthy. So, and again, a common example is pork. We know that pork carries diseases with it, did for quite some time, and in some parts of the world still does. In many parts it does not any longer, right? So in the United States, we've ridded the United States of trichinosis, for example, and other diseases that pork carries. I happen to be watching a podcast where they were talking about bringing some meat back from Spain, and it wasn't allowed because sometimes Spain has disease problems, even though they don't right now. So these people weren't able to bring this meat into the U.S. because sometimes other countries have diseases in the meat, and we don't want to bring it into the U.S. So sometimes people will say, well, they shouldn't have eaten lobster, they shouldn't have eaten pork because God was protecting them and keeping them healthy. But I don't think that's the case for a number of reasons. One reason is this goes away in Jesus' day, which we'll look at these New Testament passages. So it's not like the Lord was saying, I want Israel healthy, but I want his church to be sick. Okay, that didn't happen. And until Noah, we don't know if there was any, we weren't eating animals prior to Noah. So all humans were supposed to be vegetarians up until the time of Noah. All animals were vegetarians up until the time of Noah. That includes the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Tyrannosaurus Rex was also vegetarian up until the time of Noah, supposed to be. Changes everything for Jurassic Park, I know. But once people could start eating animals, even back in Noah's day, God made a distinction. It's not because of the animal itself. So sometimes people will say, well, like creepy crawlies, who wants to eat a creepy crawly? Who wants to eat a rabbit? I mean, some people like to eat rabbit. I have one daughter who does. I have one daughter who doesn't. But I do have a daughter who likes to eat rabbit. So so do you look at the rabbit and go, oh, how cute. I don't want to eat that. No, it's not the animal itself.